Ahí estamos. Buenas noches a todo el mundo. Bienvenidos a esta charla, Repensar la equivalencia dinámica como constructo retórico. Le damos la bienvenida al profesor Douglas Robinson, que gentilmente ha accedido a brindarnos esta charla tan importante, tan significativa para nosotros. Le damos también la bienvenida a la profesora María Leonor Sara, la directora del Departamento de Lenguas y Literaturas Modernas de la Facultad de Humanidades y Ciencias de la Educación de la Universidad Nacional de La Plata, que le va a dar la bienvenida al Dr. Robinson.
Muchas gracias, Vero. Bueno, buenas noches a todos y a todas. Es un verdadero placer para el Departamento de Lenguas y Literaturas Modernas de nuestra Casa de Estudios contar con la presencia del Dr. Douglas Robinson, a quien agradecemos, como dijo Verónica, la gentileza de ofrecer esta charla en el marco de las actividades de grado y de investigación. Agradecer también a la Cátedra de Traducción Literaria por acercarnos esta propuesta que ha sido tan bien recibida y con tanto interés, y verdaderamente es un gran placer estar compartiendo este momento con el Dr. Douglas Robinson y con todos ustedes. A la profesora traductora Verónica Raffaeli también por las gestiones para que esto sea posible en el día de la fecha. Esta propuesta verdaderamente que nos acerca en este tiempo tan incierto, pero esta tecnología que nos ofrece y nos acerca y nos da la posibilidad de estar de un lado y del otro del mundo, compartiendo este espacio que sin dudas lo celebramos porque va a ser un espacio de intercambio y de enriquecimiento. Muchas gracias, Douglas, por estar entre nosotros. Estamos muy agradecidos por esto y bueno, ojalá este sea el inicio de muchos otros intercambios. Gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted. A ustedes. Todos.
Le damos la bienvenida también al profesor Miguel Ángel Montesanti, director del Centro de Estudios de Literaturas y Literaturas Comparadas, y a las profesoras Ana María Gentile y María Laura Espoturno, miembros del Consejo Asesor del Área de Investigación en Traductología. La doctora Gentile va a dar también la bienvenida en nombre del área.
Hola, buenas noches y buenos días para Douglas. Bueno, también me sumo al agradecimiento de esta iniciativa por parte de la iniciativa de Verónica, de la cátedra, la aceptación de Douglas para dar esta charla. Y bueno, muy contenta también de que podamos organizar junto con el departamento esta conferencia, este encuentro, junto con el área de investigaciones en traductología, que como ustedes saben es un área que ya funciona hace mucho tiempo, que está en trámite ahora de ser laboratorio de investigaciones en traductología y que cuenta con la mayoría de los presentes en este momento en esta pantalla, y seguramente muchos de los participantes en la charla también habrán seguido las anteriores reuniones del famoso ya CETRA que hemos organizado en años anteriores. Así que bueno, muchas gracias por esta convocatoria, por esta posibilidad de abrir este espacio para investigadores, para alumnos, para docentes, ¿no es cierto? Y bueno, yo ahora estoy hablando un poco en nombre de la coordinadora, directora del área, que es Beatriz Cañolati, que no ha podido estar presente por problemas de conectividad, así que bueno, en nombre de ella le doy la bienvenida también a Douglas.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias entonces a las profesoras y al profesor. Si me permiten, voy a presentar al profesor Douglas Robinson. El profesor es investigador, traductor y docente de traducción. Actualmente se desempeña como profesor emérito de traducción, interpretación y estudios interculturales en la Universidad Bautista de Hong Kong. Es profesor de traducción e interpretación en la Universidad China de Hong Kong en Shenzhen y es autor de casi 30 libros y compilaciones, principalmente sobre estudios de traducción, teoría literaria, lingüística, teoría de género y retórica. Ha trabajado en docencia y gestión educativa en universidades en Finlandia, Estados Unidos, Cataluña, Rusia y Hong Kong. Es además coeditor de Target International Journal of Translation Studies. Ha ejercido extensamente como traductor en diversas áreas, con énfasis en la traducción literaria finés e inglés, y ha traducido a los autores clásicos Alexis Kivi y Walter Kilpie, así como a escritores contemporáneos. Es también autor de una novela, Saarikoski's Spirits, publicada en 2007 en traducción finesa, y de un diccionario finés-inglés. Además de 2 blogs personales, mantiene una presencia activa en Facebook, Instagram y Twitter, donde publica frecuentemente sobre temas relacionados con la traductología, la experiencia profesional de la traducción y la vida en Hong Kong. Entre sus obras han resultado especialmente significativas para nuestra comunidad educativa The Translator's Turn, de 1991, Translation and Empire, de 1997, Western Translation Theory, de 1997 y reeditada en 2015, Becoming a Translator, editada por primera vez en 1997 y ya en su 4ª edición en 2020, y Critical Translation Studies, de 2017. Una vez más, entonces, la bienvenida al profesor Robinson. Douglas, all yours.
Okay, thank you, Veronica. That sounds very impressive, all those things I've done in Spanish. I'm sorry not to be able to address you in Spanish today. My Spanish is very much at a touristic level. I grew up in Southern California and learned Mexican Spanish in primary school, and moved to Spain for 5 months on a Fulbright, hoping to improve my Spanish, and didn't realize that in Barcelona nobody wants to speak what they would rather call Castilian, and so I tried to learn Catalan and didn't get very far. But anyway, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much to the Department of Languages and Modern Languages and Literatures, and the Center for Research in Translation. I forget the exact name, at La Plata National University. I'm very happy to be speaking to you today in this this decentered fashion. This is one of the few benefits of this horrible pandemic that we're all suffering through, that we can do this. We can meet fairly easily without exhausting travel. I've never been in Argentina. I would love to visit, but barring that, this is the next best thing. So I'm speaking to you today on the topic of rethinking dynamic equivalence as a rhetorical construct. And I need to get my PowerPoint up. Hang on a second while I do that. There it is. No, that's not it. Wait a second. Huh. What do I do now? Let's see. Here it is. And start the slideshow. There. Okay. So in the course of on 20th century translation theories that I've been offering to undergraduate translation majors at Hong Kong Baptist University the past few years, I've been using Anthony Pym's book, Exploring Translation Theories, as it offers an excellent overview of the various paradigms of thinking about translation, from equivalence through scopos, descriptivism, localization, and deconstruction to cultural translation. Pim himself was a bit surprised when I told him that I was using his book with undergraduates because he said he wrote it for MA students. But my students not only seem to handle any possible difficulties in reading the text with relative ease, but every year give absolutely wonderful group presentations using the exercises at the end of each of Pim's chapters to apply the theories in the chapters to English-Chinese translation. What I'd like to discuss here is one of the points that I pass over fairly quickly in that course, namely Eugene Nida's concept of dynamic equivalence, which Pim defines in what I take to be somewhat problematic terms. Now, I assume that you all know dynamic equivalence, and you may even have met Eugene Nida. He lived a very long life, 97 years, and was active for most of that long adult life. I met him when he was in his late 80s at a conference in the UK, and a complete gentleman. I disagreed with him on lots of things, and I'll talk about some of them here, but I'm talking about his most famous theory, which is probably the most famous model of translation in Anglophone translation studies. So let's begin with a bullet point on one of my PowerPoint slides for my lecture on the first half of Pim's second chapter on natural equivalence, where I write, note that Pim defines dynamic equivalence in terms of, quote, the same or similar cultural function, not how Nida originally defined dynamic equivalence between the source reader's response and the target reader's response. But Nida did later change the term to functional equivalence. Now, assimilating Nida's earlier definition of dynamic equivalence to his later definition of functional equivalence is in fact something that quite a few commentators do, and perhaps justifiably, since Nida himself did it, giving the shift authorial sanction. But I think that's wrong and does Nida's theory a subtle injustice. In fact, I think Nida himself didn't quite appreciate what he had, what the true value of this idea was. And so when he got criticized for it, he just dumped it and shifted to functional equivalence. Pim also defines formal equivalence as, quote, following the words and textual patterns closely, and dynamic equivalence as, quote, trying to recreate the function the words might have had in their original situation, perpetuating the error, I think, that many people make about dynamic equivalence. And he notes in the next paragraph that, quote, dynamic equivalence, the illusion of the natural, is well suited to evangelical purposes. And so again, I would say that the main sentence, that it's well suited to evangelical purposes, is quite true, but the parenthetical paraphrase of dynamic equivalence as the illusion of the natural again misses what I take to be the key point in Nida's original definition, namely the illusion it creates in the target reader of the natural. So it's not just the illusion of the natural in some sort of abstract sense, like a free-floating image. Rather, it is about the impact of the translation on the target reader. So what I'm missing in Pim's and many other commentators' account of dynamic equivalence, to put that differently, is the specifically rhetorical context of Nida's original conception. Rhetoric, the art of persuasion, is obviously the interpersonal context in which religious conversion typically takes place. The missionary persuades you to convert to Christianity, and so is even better, quote, suited to evangelical purposes than vague illusions of the natural. And while Nida does not explicitly underscore the rhetorical or evangelical impulse behind his theory of dynamic equivalence, he does seem to want to present it as simply the best way to translate, not necessarily as the best way to convert people to Christianity. It should be clear from his own early definition of the model that he is fervently concerned not with abstract functions or naturalness, but with impact on the target reader. In the glossary he compiled for the Theory and Practice of Translation, 1969, he defined it as the, quote, the quality of a translation in which the message of the original text has been so transported into the receptor language that the response of the receptor is essentially like that of the original receptors. Note that without this rhetorical context, Nida's distinction is just the old segmentational whine, sense for sense versus word for word translation, in a new terminological skin. And maybe that was not such a bad thing for Nida, rhetorically speaking. After all, as he himself reminded me in the late 1980s, his target readers as a translation scholar were not the people he was trying to convert to Christianity, but his conservative colleagues in the American Bible Society, who were still mostly very attached to the solemnity of the King James Version. It was perhaps rhetorically more effective to invoke the most influential Bible translators in history, St. Jerome and Martin Luther, on the importance of translating sense for sense than it would have been to explore the rhetorical contexts and exigencies of Bible translation. In fact, one of the most persistent and pertinent critiques of Naida's concept is that there's never any way to be certain about any receptor's response. Juliana Haus, the German translation scholar, who's a conservative linguistic scholar of translation who is essentially in sympathy with Naida's preference for sense translation, chides him for the difficulty one would have establishing dynamic equivalence empirically. She writes, assuming it is true that a translation should produce equivalent responses, the question remains, however, whether the degree to which this requirement is met can be empirically tested. If it cannot be tested, it seems fruitless to postulate the requirement, and the appeal to equivalence of response is really of no more value than the philologists' and hermeneuticists' criterion of capturing the spirit of the original. If you can't prove it empirically, what's the point, right? If you can't test for equivalence of response and verify with empirical reliability as in the science of translation, then it's useless. In fact, Naida's first book on translation was called Toward a Science of Translating, which is a problematic term for this very reason, that it leaves him open to this kind of accusation. If there is no empirically verifiable way to compare the target reader's response to the source reader's response, dynamic equivalence collapses into mere abstract talk. And without that comparison, there is effectively no rhetoricity to Naida's distinction, and it does collapse back into the old notion of sense for sense translation. And I take that to be Haus's intention. Arguably, in fact, Naida's adverb essentially like that of the original receptors, is a hedge word designed to free him or anyone invoking the distinction from the necessity of establishing empirically that dynamic equivalence actually has been achieved. Naida never quite says this, but my reading is that dynamic equivalence for him is not so much a test for translation quality assurance, Haus's primary concern, but rather a receptor construct imagined by the translator to guide the work of translation. Another way of putting that is that for Naida, dynamic equivalence is not the ontology of translation, its true nature, its true measure of accuracy, whose truth must be scientifically verifiable, but the phenomenology of translation, which is to say how it feels to translate, how the translator experiences the act of translating, what guidance the translator needs to achieve an acceptable result. Yet another way of saying that, I'm suggesting dynamic equivalence for Naida is a heuristic rather than an evidential straitjacket. A heuristic is just a mode of proceeding, a mode of discovering the best way to proceed. So in this sense, oops, what did I do? The reading of Naida offered by Maria Tomachko is trenchant. While she doesn't explicitly call Naida's translation theory rhetorical, her list of the factors on which Naida bases his approach comes straight out of textbooks on rhetoric. She writes, did I put that there? Yeah. He argues that the method of translation must relate to the purpose of the translation, the goals of the translator, the nature and needs of the audience, and the historical and social context. Very, very rhetorical way of thinking. While she also notes that Naida probably holds to conservative theories of meaning in part because of his religious beliefs, she argues those conservative stabilizations of meaning form a thin veneer over a deeper concern for culture-specific, audience-oriented purpose. In that longer quote, she writes, it may seem strange to link Naida's functionalist theory of translation, developed for Bible translation, to the production of propaganda before and during World War II, and to the burgeoning of advertising after the war. but all these activities have commonalities, not the least being an acute understanding of the effectiveness of controlled and manipulated textual processing for achieving specific social goals. Again, rhetoric. In an intellectual tradition that has long been fixated on the properties of semantically stabilized translation products in comparison with the properties of their semantically stabilized originals, however, this cluster of rhetorical concerns and orientations, when it's been noticed at all, has often been construed as an attempt to weasel out of an entirely legitimate demand for positivistic evidence. So I want to insert my disclaimer here that my own voice has been one of those raised against Naida's distinction in the translator's turn, not because it's insufficiently rigorous or evidenced or product-oriented, obviously, but because it is insufficiently rhetorical. And therefore, as I suggested just now, ultimately just the old segmentational wine in a new terminological skin. But I've recently begun to rethink that earlier dismissal in Translating the Problem of Sway, where I suggested that rhetoricizing equivalence was in fact a masterstroke on Naida's part. And what we should do with the notion of dynamic equivalence is not to dismiss it as not really rhetorical, but to explore the complexities of the rhetorical situations in which translators work toward the creation of a target text. So now let's ask what it might mean to rethink Naida's theory of dynamic equivalence rhetorically. The obvious place to start would be Aristotle's Rhetoric, which is the world's first rhetoric textbook. Aristotle argued that rhetoric is typically engaged through three cognitive channels. Logos, which is speech, but specifically logical speech. Logos, the Greek word logos, becomes the English word logic, based on rational argumentation, proofs, and so on. The second one is ethos, or character, meaning the ethical, self-image projected by the speaker. You can trust me because I'm honest, I'm sincere, I care passionately about the same things you do, I'm a lot like you. And the third, pathos, or emotion, feeling. Not surprisingly, Aristotle, a philosopher who was also an aristocratic male, favored logos. Logos is the master channel, through which the masters of society master not only what they talk and write about, but how they talk about those things. Ideally, in traditional master talk and master thought, logos was supposed to be the channel through which the masters master their social inferiors. The rich mastering the poor, men mastering women, light-skinned people mastering dark-skinned people, Europeans mastering the rest of the world, and so on. But Aristotle recognized that much as he too wanted that logos-based master rhetoric to allow him and his peers to master their inferiors, it didn't work. Rhetoric as mastery required more than logos. And also, tellingly, the more one began to study the other channels by which persuasion is effected, the more democratic and egalitarian rhetoric perforce became. By insisting transformatively on the ethical connection between speaker and audience created through ethos, projection of character, Aristotle began to recognize the rhetorical power of addressing people as equals, and thus also of not mastering them so much as working with them to achieve commonly agreed upon goals. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how logical your argumentation is. If you can't connect with your audience at the level of character, and especially shared character, the ways in which we, right, in this room, all of us in this room here globally, are all basically the same. Because, you know, I'm a man and some of you are women and I'm an American and most of you aren't and so on, but we're all translators and we all care passionately about translators. Therefore, there is this sameness to us, this commonality to the connection of our conversation, and you can trust me and I can trust you, and trust can circulate through our community, right? That's the basic idea of rhetoric as Aristotle rethought it in his book. If you can't connect with your audience at that level, you won't convince them. Aristotle clearly felt the most distrustful of pathetic or emotional rhetoric and tended to associate it with stupid people, whom He, again, not coincidentally, as an aristocratic male, thought were mostly to be found in the working class. But he not only insisted on the power and importance of emotions, in book 2 of the Rhetoric, he built a whole psychology around those emotions, with detailed accounts of various emotions and emotional dispositions, which he encouraged his students to learn from and draw on in making their various cases. Now, the first interesting thing to note about these three channels is that it is really only in the logical channel, translation as rhetoric, as logos, as mastery, the dynamic equivalence might be dismissed as sense-for-sense translation, with a very thin and not particularly convincing veneer of rhetoricity stretched over it. The translation is a purely textual affair in which each segment of the source text must align logically with the corresponding segment of the target text. Then dynamic equivalence is primarily a term for that alignment that specifies the desirable length of the segment, the sentence rather than the word. Secondarily, perhaps we might consider alternative types of logos-based equivalence. If the segments in the two texts must align semantically and as syntactically and pragmatically as possible, dynamic equivalence is just a new term for what Jerome was the first to call sense-for-sense translation. If the criterion for alignment is not meaning but function, say persuasive function or explanatory function or whatever, then Pym's summary of dynamic equivalence is accurate, and NIDA might as well rename it functional equivalence. But now, what happens when we understand dynamic equivalence in NIDA's own terms as an essential similarity between the source reader's response to the source text and the target reader's response to the target text, and understand that similarity not as logos, but as ethos, as a channel of similar authorial character, or authorial and lectorial, right? The character circulating through our community. What happens when you think about dynamic equivalence that way? What happens when we understand that similarity as pathos, as a channel of similar feeling? We feel connected. We feel like we can trust each other, and so on. It should be clear, for example, that it is precisely in the rhetorical realms of ethos and pathos that NIDA's own rhetorical problems with his bosses in the American Bible Society, and more generally with conservative American churchgoers and Bible readers, became most pressing. One of NIDA's favorite examples is that because the meaning of the verb to want has changed over the 4 centuries since the creation of the King James Version, 1611, it is easy for modern speakers of English to misread the opening line of the 23rd Psalm, which in the King James is, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," meaning I shall not lack anything. And to read it misleadingly to mean that I shall not want the Lord as my shepherd. This is the case NIDA makes, that modern readers are going to misunderstand that line because the change of the word, meaning of the word want. But it doesn't really matter how convincingly one demonstrates that the King James Version distorts the original logically. If Bible readers, including the conservative factions in the American Bible Society, continue to cling to a pathos-based construction of the King James Version as emotionally satisfying because aesthetically beautiful and verbally familiar, and to an ethos-based construction of the King James Version as dignified and solemn, as saturated with the dignified authority of 4 centuries of use in Protestant churches, and thus apparently, rhetorically, with the ethos of God's own authority. In order to win churchgoers and Bible readers over to the Good News Bible, the American Bible Society didn't just have to convince them that it was more accurate and more readable, it also had to retrain them to feel the Bible and the authorial character it projected differently. The Bible Society worked hard to convince the American Protestant community the Bible was meant to be understood, and understood specifically in people's ordinary language, not understood logically, right? Through logos, not to wash over them affectively, precognitively, through pathos, with the high solemnity of archaic usage. That was an appeal to the rhetorical logos of translation, a tough sell for the religious devout. an easily understandable Bible in colloquial English seemed, and still seems today, to many, to be a diminishment of the Bible's ethos, or air of authority, a dragging it down into the marketplace, which was, of course, precisely where Martin Luther instructed the Bible translator to go to find the German words and phrases he used. Luther says, don't translate the letter of the Bible. Go into the marketplace, go into the homes, watch ordinary Germans, watch their mouths as they move, and translate that way. That was Luther's instruction, a very controversial position he took. And arguably, NIDA is following Luther, but in fact, in his focus on the Logos, the easily understood part of the Bible, he's maybe not quite in line with Luther. One way of framing this problem would be to note that for most believers, perhaps, religion is not about logical cognitive understanding, or logos. It's about feeling, what Aristotle calls pathos, a feeling of safety and security at base. Ideally also a feeling of heightened reality, emotional intensity. Liturgical and other rituals tend to contribute much more strongly to pathos than they do to logos. Add to that orientation now that the fact that for English-speaking believers with no Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, i.e. almost everyone, the authoritative source text of the Bible, the phenomenological ground of biblical ethos, is not the one written in those original languages, but the Bible of their childhoods. For most churchgoers in the early decades of NIDA's campaign, that was the King James Version. One might even suggest that while NIDA's campaign for dynamic equivalence could and perhaps should have been to get people to accept the Good News Bible, their new translation, based on NIDA's dynamic equivalence, on ethos and pathos-based grounds, as both authoritative and sweet, and thus ultimately sweeter and more authoritative than the King James, it ended up placing all its eggs in the basket of logos. Even if the King James Version remains sweeter and more authoritative, the Good News Bible is more accurate and easier to understand. If that's a fair characterization, the implicit message would be something like Aristotle's disdain for the commoners who required an ethos-based connection and pathos-based emotional resonances. Only stupid Christians continue to prefer the King James Version over the patently superior Good News Bible. This is an aggressive parallel to draw, perhaps, but consider another rhetorical aspect of Bible translation that confirms this privileging of logos over ethos and pathos. In the 3rd century before the Christian era, the 70, or Septuagint, translators of the Hebrew Bible into Greek famously made a serious error in translating Isaiah 7:14, rendering the Hebrew word almah, young girl or young woman, as parthenos, virgin, so that the young girl or woman who was with child in that verse was specifically a virgin. This verse was picked up by the early Greek-speaking Christians who had no Hebrew as a prophecy referring to Jesus, born 7 centuries later to the Virgin Mary. Nearly every Bible translation since has maintained that error, because while logos-based equivalence would seem to require that a young woman give birth, that level of accuracy would also seem to deny one of the basic tenets of Christian faith, that Mary was a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus. Proof that his father was not Joseph or some other human man, but God. Thus, in 1970, when the New English Bible rendered the passage logos correctly as a young woman is with child, the outcry among devout Christians was fierce. Some conservative pastors burned the translation. Others, showing more logos-based restraint, wrote and published detailed critiques of the misunderstandings reflected in it. The willingness to accept the semantically correct translation, even if it undermines traditional assumptions about the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, namely the assumption that Isaiah 7:14 is a prophecy pointing 7 centuries ahead to Jesus, is logos. Focusing entirely on semantic correctness is logos. A passionate adherence to Christian doctrine as a justification for rejecting the logos correct translation is pathos. I am emotionally attached to my faith. And ethos, the church is the ultimate authority for what God wants me to believe. So, how did the American Bible Society, under the intellectual leadership of Eugene Nida, translate Isaiah 7:14 in the Good News Bible? 6 years after the New English Bible in 1976, which side did it take? The logos-based adherence to semantic accuracy or the ethos and pathos-based adherence to Christian doctrine? This is what they produced. Well then, the Lord himself will give you a sign. A young woman who is pregnant will have a son and will name him Emmanuel. They chose logos over ethos and pathos. At young woman, they put a footnote. The Hebrew word here translated young woman is not the specific term for virgin, but refers to any young woman of marriageable age. The use of virgin in Matthew 1:23 reflects a Greek translation of the Old Testament made some 500 years after Isaiah. In other words, it's not about Christian faith, it's a translation history. The main thing for the Bible Society to do is not protect Christians' religious feelings or the authority of the church, but to get the meanings right. And consider the rhetorical requirements of Nida's definition of dynamic equivalence as the quality of translation in which the message of the original text has been so transported into the receptor language that the response of the receptor is essentially like that of the original receptors. The original receptors of Isaiah 7:14 were not Christians. The book of Isaiah was written sometime between 740 and 686 before the Christian era. Dynamic equivalence requires that readers of the Good News Bible respond to this passage not as Augustine commanded Christians to respond to it in the 4th century of the Christian era, 1,000 years after Isaiah, let alone as Greeks in Alexandria would have responded to the Septuagint translation in the 3rd century before the Christian era, but as Hebrew readers would have responded to it, say, around 700 before the Christian era, with no foreknowledge of later Christian attempts to make Isaiah 7:14 a prophecy of Jesus' birth. The Emmanuel, whose birth was prophesied in that verse, was not even the Jewish Messiah. He was just a protector of the house of David against its enemies, who would soon lay it waste and banish most of the 10 northern Davidic tribes into exile. At most, the birth of Emmanuel would have been read as a promise to Israel that their God would not abandon them in exile. You don't need to be born to a virgin to accomplish that. So what does this rhetorical reframing of Nida's most famous concept give us? It redirects our attention from translation as sense for sense versus word for word translation, since dynamic equivalence has been understood as the former, and from translation as functional equivalence, as Nida himself later restated it, to translation as interpersonal persuasion. So far from a static structure of linguistic equivalence, it's a psychosocial channel of motivated interaction between human beings. And running the rhetorical thrust of dynamic equivalence through Aristotle's 3 modes of persuasion, logos, ethos, and pathos, helps us to understand not only the limitations of Nida's own approach, but the complexity of all translation as doing things to people with words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug, for that enlightening presentation. I think we're full of questions, at least I feel I am.
I'm trying to get rid of this PowerPoint so we can
okay.
see. Maybe you want to ask questions about the PowerPoint. I'll leave it up, I guess. Yes. So are you getting questions?
Mm-hmm. We're trying to reach the questions that come through the feed. I hope Javier helps me with that. I'm not sure whether I should be the first one. Perhaps my betters can start. Otherwise, I can start by, well, something. First of all, I want to say something that I forgot to say at the beginning. I forgot to thank you immensely for not just the opportunity, which we're immensely grateful for, but for all the patience you've had with all of our comings and goings and all the trials and tribulations we've had with connections and setting up the conference. I needed to say that publicly because really you've been wonderful about the whole process. I was
Yes.
fascinated by the idea of I'm from this logos and pathos difference. I got the feeling that underneath all this is a basic idea of finding truth somewhere and finding truth in logos. Is it really possible to find truth there in logic? Isn't there truth, as much truth in pathos and in ethos as in logos? Assuming that there is some truth that can be achieved, that can be reached, that can be known.
Different kind of truth, isn't it? It's a felt truth through pathos, and especially through what I consider the pathetic cycling of emotion through authority and so on, right? The cycling of authority through feeling. That I've called that the deep ecology of rhetoric, where rhetoric is persuading, becoming, believing as it circulates through the community. In that, truth is felt, and what one person feels as truth may not be the same as what somebody else feels as truth. The whole idea of logos is to banish that kind of relativity through an appeal to not just logos as a technique, a techne in Greek, right? Or as a methodology, but logos as, especially in the Christian era, logos as participating in the mind of God. God is a logical creator. He created us in his image. Therefore, when we are logical, especially we white men, right? This has been the thinking of the colonial thinking, really, of European scholars for hundreds of years, for 2,000 years, let's say, that because we white men, especially educated upper class white men, can think logically, we know what God means. We can participate in God's logical thinking. That not just God's thinking, but in the very mechanism of creation. And all those lesser people, right? The poor people and the women and the dark-skinned people and everybody else in the world, they can't do that. They're just lost in the wash of feeling. The idea is somehow that logos transports us beyond the human to the superhuman, and that is obviously bullshit. There's no other way of putting it, right?
That can be
nonsense.
Empirically proved.
The rhetorical feeling of truth is all we have to go on. And what has been happening over the last few decades globally and importantly is that the voices of the people who have been excluded in the past are now surging into prominence, and we're discovering the cultural differences between this felt truth and that felt truth, and recognizing that those felt truths are realities, right? This is social constructivism, right? To the extent that we take our felt truth to be reality, that's a socially constructed reality. This is the culmination, really, of a line of thinking that begins with Kant, moves through Nietzsche, and then through post-structuralism, especially Lacan on the real and so on, to this awareness that cultural difference creates different realities, different truths, different identities. And it is purely a socio-political power move to say that our reality is the only true one and yours is wrong, or yours is sheer chaos. Does that get at your question?
Absolutely, but it creates even more questions because going by that, what, as much as we can do, is to project our need to persuade, and that is evidently rhetorical as well. So, is there any? Are we not doing rhetorics at any point?
Yeah, all communication is rhetorical. I agree. All persuasion is what Austin calls doing things to people with words. Yeah, that's performativity, right? Scientific, natural science, in his attempt to marshal positivistic evidence in its truth claims, is doing rhetoric. Because a certain kind of scientifically minded audience will only believe that kind of evidence. That's what makes it seem true. That the speaker and the audience accept those canons of evidence.
So it's an agreement.
Yeah.
So it's a little more than the social contract in which we agree that we are going to take something as truth, and we're going to take something as logos, and we're going to find something and locate it as the sense that was in the original.
Yeah. And this is why I'm strongly opposed to corpus-based research. People who love corpora tend to believe that they are dealing with real language. And it's not, of course, it's not real language. A corpus is a representation of real language. Real language is what people do in conversation. It's difficult to analyze, difficult to theorize because it's evanescent. But those conversational engagements are rhetorical, and what a corpus does is reduce them to inert symbols on the page that can be studied as abstract structure. So that's imposing logos on conversation.
Trying to fit reality into boxes.
To
study under a microscope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Study.
We have. I'm sorry.
Let's study love. Let's study love under the microscope. Let's study honor under the microscope. Let's find the truth.
It's impossible.
The reductive biological truth. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Truth will not be found there. We have a related question coming from the feed. It says, how does rhetoric come into play in the post-truth era?
Well, this is the problem that, the post-truth era is apparently a celebration of this rhetorical model of all conversation. The idea is that because there is no truth, it doesn't really matter how you lie. You can make things up to convince your audience, and your audience, because they like you, will agree, and so on, and that's okay. And really, there is no principled way of attacking, critiquing that from within a social constructivist, post-positivistic perspective. What progressive theorists of language would say would be that while it is true that every culture, every community has its own reality and its own constructs of truth, and every community believes those constructs to be reality, to be true, and despises all the other communities, all the other cultures as misguided and misled. From a translational point of view, it's important to bridge between. to build connections, to find ways of not equating but equalizing discourses, so that mediation is possible. So that it becomes possible to understand discourse A in terms of discourse B, and discourse B in terms of discourse A, and also that means community A and culture A, and so on, right? So that rather than simply withdrawing behind the wall of your truth constructs, you remain open to the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. I don't know if we have, I don't want to be greedy with questions, but do we have any other questions from the panel? All right, let me take another one then. You've, no spoilers, but you've mentioned rhythm in several of your writings, and I was wondering whether you associate rhythm and corporality, the corporality of rhythm and language, with pathos or with logos. And it's particularly close to my heart because I do phonology and translation, and I cannot even imagine translation without phonology as a companion, and rhythm is a big part of that. So I was wondering whether you could tell us your opinion about that.
Yes, I would definitely associate it with pathos. Although, I mean, pathos is an embodied mapping of bodily sensations, basically. Affect is a mental mapping of bodily sensations. And one of the bodily sensations would be movement. You can feel yourself walking, you can feel yourself standing up or sitting down and so on. You can also feel your hunger, your tiredness, and so on. Those are pathos-based feelings that would involve proprioception, interoception, and so on. Rhythm is, I suppose it's phonology. I'm not a linguist, I'm a literature scholar, and so I would call it prosodics, prosody. Rhythm is very important in literary discourse. People usually think of prose as having rhythm and verse as having meter, but really rhythm is important everywhere there. And obviously it's also important in the way we talk. A person with ineffectual rhythms in his or her speech will be perceived as boring or creepy or frightening or insane. The better able you are to integrate your sense of rhythm with what you want to say, the easier it will be to understand you, and the more comfortable people will feel around you. And I suppose that's also phonology, although phonology for me has the air of the linguistics textbook, and therefore also the reduction of language to abstract structure. I studied phonology in a linguistics course. I took a phonology class, and that was all about abstract structures. Rhythm tends to be felt more than it's easier to feel it than it is to reduce it to structure. I would totally agree that rhythm is absolutely essential to all translation, certainly to interpreting. Although for simultaneous interpreting, it's often difficult to think beyond just the meanings of the words and getting the syntax more or less right. In translation, though, even when I spent 30 years translating non-literary texts, even translating, say, an instruction manual for a diesel engine, it seems to me absolutely essential to get the rhythm right. because rhythm carries meaning. It helps the reader understand what you're trying to do. And if you don't care about rhythm in translating, you will be just as boring or just as creepy or just as scary or whatever as a person who doesn't do rhythms well. So yes, I completely agree with that view. I'm not sure how you get past the abstract structure traditions of phonology, but I'm assuming, given your question, that you do.
We do, indeed. Through discourse analysis, through the study of discourse intonation, and happily through the study of drama.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, we mediate through literature in general, but precisely through the meanings that can be carried across by means of drama. And that gives us the possibility of understanding any language use at all as an instance of performance, really.
Yeah, and in fact, the performativity of language, the body language, including rhythm and other called vocalizations, prosodics, but also tone of voice, facial expression, gestures, posture, and so on. Body language is the embodied performativity of language. It's not something added on to language. It is, it's the bulk of language. 93%, according to Albert Mehrabian, is body language. 7% is the meanings of the words. And because the performativity, the embodied performativity of language is so powerful, we can often understand more or less what someone is saying in a language that we don't understand. We can read
Absolutely.
body language very, very effectively. We can even read minds based on body language. Certainly with people we know well, people we live with, right? Your partner does not have to say, "I'm angry," to make it clear that he or she is angry, right? You can feel it instantly. The person walks into the room, you say, "Oh God, I'm in trouble," right? Because body language is so powerful.
I have so many questions and I need to choose. I want to give others the choice as well, but people appear to be shy still. I cannot resist the temptation of asking about Gulliver. It would be fantastic for us if you could tell us something about your latest, what you call transcreation, and I'm convinced that you're an author, or at least a co-author. The latest, your latest translation of Walter Kilpie's Gulliver.
It's just out. It's been out for just over 1 week. It was published on International Translation Day,
An
which was
auspicious
also my
day.
birthday.
Yep.
Very
auspicious
nice.
Day all round.
Exactly.
You planned
I got
it.
very interested. Yeah. I got very interested in that book because Kilpie, it was his last novel, and he left it unfinished at his death. It was published posthumously, not 5 years after his death. And I got interested in it because he claimed, he was a university librarian in Finland. He claimed that this manuscript appeared on his desk as part of the remains of an estate. And it was in English. He read it, realized that it must have been written by Lemuel Gulliver himself, and he decided to translate it into Finnish. So this novel that I might translate is claimed as a translation. And so I got the idea that instead of claiming to translate it, I could claim to edit it. That I discovered the manuscript, the same manuscript that he discovered. I found it in a rare book library. Instead of translating it, because it was already in English, I just edited it. And so all my annotations all the way through the book are based on the assumption that I'm the editor, this is the book that I'm editing. I sometimes point out Kilpi's translations as translations. I mean, he wrote the book, but I call them his translations. And then I also finished the book. I wrote the book to the end based on Kilpi's notion, his instructions to his son of how he planned to finish it. On the cover, I call it by Walter Kilpi, a transcreation by Douglas Robinson. But inside the book, it's all about me editing it. And then I created a fictitious Finnish critic who is really, really angry at me for stealing this book from Kilpi, because it's obviously Kilpi's novel, and I'm trying to take credit for it. Like Kinbout in Nabokov's novel Pale Fire, which is a book that I just absolutely love, and it was sort of the inspiration for this version. So I'm playing with the epistemological game of pretending that this is a found manuscript, right? The novel has been doing that since the very beginning, since Rabelais, since Cervantes. Cervantes plays with the notion that this was written in Arabic, and he found a Spanish translator to work on it, and then the manuscript ran out, and so he went to the marketplace and found another manuscript, and it turned out to be a continuation, and so on, right? Cervantes loves playing with that notion that this is a found translation, and Kilpi does the same thing. I love that kind of play, where it's not really undermining the creativity of the author. It's simply playing with the illusion of reality. And as a result, I had a very hard time finding a publisher for it. And once I did find a publisher, the publisher applied for a translation subvention to pay my fee from the Finnish Literature Society, and they turned them down. We did not get a subvention because what I was doing was too radical, too wild, too weird, whatever. They didn't give a justification, but it's not difficult to guess what the reason was.
So you came up with a project yourself, and you went to the publisher with it.
I did it. Yeah, I shipped it around for almost a year. It was very difficult to find anybody willing to take a risk on it because it was so strange.
Mm-hmm. Was it finished when you took it to the publisher?
I started taking it to publishers when it was about half finished. I created a sample and a proposal and so on. And during that year that I was working on it, I was shipping it around and getting no response. And I finally finished it and then found a publisher. So it worked out okay.
Mm-hmm. At any point, did you feel tempted to just give in and try something else, something easier, something more publishable?
Well, I always have other projects. And during that time I was working on other things as well, and they got published. I know how to publish an academic book. That's no problem. And I'm also being hired to translate sometimes whole novels, more often novel samples. Rights managers will hire me to translate, say, the first 50 or 60 pages of a novel so they can sell translation rights at various international book fairs.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like,
Maria Laura, would you like to turn on your microphone so that we can have some conversation?
I do have a question that my connection is quite unstable. I'm afraid, so I just wrote it. So many thanks for your wonderful talk. As I wrote there, we're really interested in thinking of translation as related to the notion of faithless. And I say we because there are actually two research projects in our based at our center, which are actually right now dealing with establishing or looking at translation from a rhetorical point of view. not exactly as you presented it, of course, but perhaps drawing from classical rhetorics and then the re-elaboration done within discourse analysis. And here I'm thinking about French theories like Ruth Amassis, Oswald, etc. And there are actually, well, many different books right now which have dealt with this notion. Myriam Suchet's heterolinguism actually deals with this notion from a different perspective and looking at mostly at literary translation in a corpus of heterolingual texts. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that work or whether you have thoughts about the contribution of discourse analysis to, you know, in dealing with the notion of ethos.
I don't know that at all. I'm sorry, and I'd really like to look into it. If you wouldn't mind, I'd be very happy if you could send me.
Well, okay. This was actually Myriam Suchet's doctoral dissertation, which was, I can't remember. Ana Gentile might remember the university. I don't know if it was Concordia's University in Canada. And I think Paul Bandia was the supervisor for that dissertation. And then we have produced, and we have a book on the way in which we deal with the notion of ethos from, you know, discursive perspective as applied to mostly to literary translation. But well, Ana Gentile has also applied the notion to legal discourse by now, right? And there's a paper or a chapter already published in that. I don't know, Ana, if you would like to add anything.
No, that she works at the Concordia University and at Sorbonne University.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, my main work in rhetoric so far hasn't dealt. I mean, in some sense, everything I've done for the last whatever 3 or 4 decades is in rhetoric, but directly addressing rhetorical concerns is a fairly new thing for me over the last 10, 15 years. And the book that I don't know if you know this. Let me put it in the chat. Deep Ecology of Rhetoric in Mencius and Aristotle, which is SUNY Press, 2016. There I develop that model of, I mentioned the deep ecology in my talk, and that model I developed by reading Aristotle and Mencius, sort of cross-reading them and building a kind of composite rhetorical theory out of their convergences. Aristotle and Mencius are usually thought of as polar opposites. Aristotle as the reductive rationalist who despises women and the working class and non-Greeks and so on, and Mencius as the ecological thinker from ancient China. They were almost exact contemporaries, and I read Aristotle against the grain to find his grounding in what I consider a more ecological approach to rhetoric than the logos-based one of abstract structure. I'm not sure, I don't know discourse analysis well enough to be able to guess at what you would do with ethos, unless it's critical discourse analysis. Are you talking about power and ideology, or where is the ethos in discourse analysis and a discourse analysis approach to translation?
No. We are not talking about critical discourse analysis as in Fowler or, well, Ruth Wodak, etc., but rather on the development of discourse analysis done mainly from the point of view of French linguistics, like Ducrot, Amorsy, Menguenon, and so on. So it's a different approach to discourse altogether. And I think it's 1984 when Oswald Lecoq publishes Le Dire et le Dit. And there, one of the categories that he defines is the category of ethos as the discursive image that is attributed to, well, he calls it in French, locuteur, but that would be the speaker, right? With a capital S, like the fictional persona, like we get in speech. Normally thinking about spoken language, but that has been applied to written discourse as well, particularly after Ruth Amosis published her book, L'image de soi dans le discours in 1999. And so after that, there is a doctoral dissertation, but then a book by Myriam Suchet, in which she establishes these categories, but then again, she's always thinking about literary translation. And well, there is a whole thing about narratology that has to be observed there, right? And so our approach is my research project, at least, it's a bit different because I tend to follow Chapman's and Booth's notion about, the authorial figure in the text. And there was a special issue of Target in 1996, where Theo Hermans and Juliana Schiavi published two complementary articles. And so where she defines the figure of the implied translator. And this is a notion that we take to sort of relate the ethos, because the question would be in translation, when we consider translated discourse, is ethos attributed to discourse, or is it attributed to the persona that appears as responsible for the enunciation of, right? So that would be.
Yeah, Theo Hermans was picked up on Miriam Diaz-Teocaris' translator function. Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. In 96, 97, around in there, he was working on it. And actually, he and I were both picking that up at the same time. So yeah, I don't know. I can't read French, so maybe that's the problem. And I don't read much linguistics. And are you writing in Spanish or English?
I have actually written in English and in Spanish on this, okay. But I can, if you wish, I can.
I'd like to see the sources.
I can write an email to you later. Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. Excellent. ¿Otras preguntas?
We have some comments coming from the feed.
Okay.
And Alia comments that we have to have many variables in mind to translate culture and deconstruct meanings. So she's thinking of deconstruction here and the connection to culture, I guess. Suna Akalin leaves a question about competence versus performance. Quite deep, I guess. Would you say there is a connection or a contrast?
Well, it's a very long discussion. We were just talking about French, and Shoshana Fellman has a brilliant book from 1980 called Le Scandale du Corps Parlant. I don't know if anybody knows that, the scandal of the speaking body. J.L. Austin with Molière, or J.L. Austin with Don Juan, I guess it was. She looks at the attempt to recuperate Austin's performative through competence. Specifically applying Chomsky to Austin's notion of performativity, the performative utterance, in order to idealize it out of the impasse that Austin found. In his 1955 lecture series, How to Do Things with Words, which was published posthumously in 1962, Austin first says there are two kinds of utterances: constitutive utterances that say things and performative utterances that perform actions, like I now pronounce you man and wife, or I bet you $10, or I christen this ship the Joseph Stalin. And for 7 lectures, he tries to distinguish them and finally concludes that they can't be distinguished because all performatives say things and all constitutives perform actions. And so he crumbles them up and throws them away. And a number of linguists and philosophers of language, Gerald Katz, Émile Benveniste, and others, tried to recover Austin's distinction by idealizing it, saying, and John Searle did the same thing in 1969 in his book Speech Acts. If you retreat to a high enough level of abstraction, you can treat the performative utterance as pure structure instead of doing things to people with words. So that has always been the danger for a certain kind of scientifically minded person, I suppose you'd have to say, who wants to retreat from the real world into the world of scientific abstraction. Performance, what people actually do in the real world, is ultimately the danger that we have to protect ourselves against. That is what Saussure called la parole, speech. We don't study that, we study la langue. Chomsky talks about competence and performance. We study competence, not performance. We ignore performance because it's just no good. People make mistakes. We can't really judge anything in language based on what people actually do. We have to study their abstract psychological competence in language. That is, for me, that's the enemy. That's the wrong way of thinking that I set myself in opposition to. And to my mind, a rhetorical approach to translation or to anything, especially a rhetorical approach that focuses more on ethos and pathos than on logos, is all about re-energizing the study of language through performance, through what people actually do.
We have some more questions coming in, and we have some people coming in to Zoom to get their question in. I'm activating Cecilia Leos. We're giving her a minute to connect. Cecilia, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. People coming in to Zoom to get their question in. I can hear myself. Cecilia Leos. Giving her a minute to connect. Cecilia, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
You need to turn your microphone on. She just disappeared.
Whoops. Connection trouble. Let's admit Maria Eugenia Andriani in the meantime. And Ricardo Piccolo. And we'll see who can get online first.
Okay.
I see many known names. I see Daniel Espinosa. I see Dulce Minaudo. We have some delay on Facebook. That's why it takes a couple of minutes to reach the feed. Now I'm admitting people in the waiting room so that they can take a minute to log in and activate their microphones.
Who would like to ask a question?
Hello, Douglas.
Yes, hello.
Daniela, hello.
My name is Daniela.
Daniela,
I'm a former student at the University of La Plata. I have a question. What are your tips for a good transcreation?
Wow.
The fact is that nobody quite knows what a transcreation is. There are translation agencies that market themselves as doing transcreations, and as far as I can tell, not only does every agency think of that as a different kind of activity, but every transcreation job is different. So it's very hard to give tips on how to do it. And in fact, my transcreation of Kilpi's final unfinished novel, unfinished posthumously published novel, is probably not really a good model because it was very difficult to publish, but also because it's extreme. I'm doing a lot of things in it. I kept coming up with new ideas and being very pleased with myself for doing it. And so I think it's probably, there's a lot to grapple with in that. I've been very pleasantly surprised, though, given the difficulty I had publishing it, that there's been a lot of interest in reviewing it. I have sent out, had the publisher send out 12 review copies so far, and all of these people that have wanted to review it are really, really excited about all the different things that are going on in it. And I'm hoping that with 12 different reviews, possibly more, they will cover something like all the different things I was doing, because most likely one person in one review would not be able to or not be interested in everything and so on. I don't know. I think that the basic thing is that translation should, to my mind, cover this kind of thing as well. We don't really need a term like transcreation. Translation is always transformation. Everything changes in a translation, but we do still have these traditional notions that the translation captures the meaning and the style of the source text in a quantitatively comparable way. So not necessarily the exact same number of words or the same number of sentences, but roughly the same number of sentences and so on. So that if you have 1/10 the number of sentences, then that's an adaptation, maybe for children or whatever, right? It's a summary. Transcreation is a useful term in getting people away from that kind of narrow definition of translation and thinking about the world of possibility that really should be open to things that involve translation, but also involve more than translation. In the Middle Ages, almost all translation was like that. People would translate and they would add their own things to it. They would add commentary, and they would add other people's words. They would create stories and poems and so on. Medieval translation was arguably always transcreation, and the Renaissance purified all that for us. I guess the Renaissance and the Reformation, and maybe now we're getting back to something like the freewheeling openness to a wide variety of approaches. And because it's freewheeling, there are no clear benchmarks for excellence. I guess ultimately the benchmarks for excellence are whether the audience likes it. So, sorry.
So rhetoric again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Persuasion again.
Yeah, exactly. Persuasion.
Yeah. We can have another question from the people who came in Zoom. You can just activate your microphone and go for it.
Hi, I'm also a student at the university. I can see actually one of my teachers here. I just wanted to say thank you for taking your time and I wanted to say that your presentation was very interesting. I was worried that I wouldn't maybe understand, but I think I got everything you said. So thank you.
Excellent. I'm very relieved. I'm always afraid that I'll be so pleased with my own thinking that that I forget about my audience. I'm glad that you were able to follow.
I also wanted to ask you something. I don't know if you want to answer or not. Maybe it's a little bit personal, but how did you end up in Hong Kong? Because I think when I graduate, I want to work in China, in mainland China, and maybe in, I don't know if you know, Zhejiang province.
No, I don't.
But I wanted to know how you end up working there, because that's what I want to do in the future.
Well, 11 or 12 years ago, I started thinking that I've lived in Europe a lot, something almost 20 years, and 14 years in Finland, 2 years in Russia. My familiarity with European languages, at least, you know, a smattering of tourist communication in pretty much every language in Europe is good. I can speak German and Finnish and Russian, I'd been in the U.S. for 21 years, and I was starting to think maybe that's enough. Maybe I need to go out into the world again. Started looking at Europe, and then I started thinking, well, maybe you know, there's this whole part of the world that I've never lived in. I don't have any experience of it. I'd been to China once, but maybe I ought to look for jobs. So I was looking for jobs in Greater China and applied for 7 in Hong Kong. They seemed to have the best presentation, perhaps. And I got offered one, and I moved here 10 years ago. Now, you know, Hong Kong is really in major transition as mainland China begins to step up the transition to becoming a regular part of the mainland. And Hong Kong people are very worried that this is the end of Hong Kong. And so what I've done is moved across the border. I'm still in Hong Kong right now. The travel ban makes it difficult, but my full-time job now is in Shenzhen, which is in Guangdong province, across the border from Hong Kong, and I'm really enjoying it. For the last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of traveling in mainland China. I think I may be better known in mainland China as a translation scholar than anywhere else in the world, and so I get invited a lot, and I really enjoy it. I love going to mainland China, and so the idea of working in Shenzhen, you know, the Wild West of China. It's the South, but it's sort of like the Wild West. It's boom town, you know, San Francisco, 1849, there's a real excitement to what's going on there. So I would encourage you. It's very interesting. Are you studying Chinese, Putonghua?
Yes.
Okay, good. Good luck with it. Buena suerte.
Multilingual here. we're wondering whether we have any more questions now. Your latest comment made me think that perhaps you believe there's a particular reason why you're so popular in Asian countries and in China in particular as a translation scholar. Is there a deeper appreciation for your scholarship there than in the West?
I don't really know. I mean, one thing that I've noticed is that when I talk to Western audiences about the somatics of translation, there's often a misunderstanding of what I'm saying. I got very tired of hearing in the 90s, hearing people say, oh, you're Doug Robinson. You're the guy who says translators don't have to think. They just have to feel. The translator's turn never said that, of course, but because I talk about the importance of feeling, somatics, a lot of Western thinkers who think that feeling and thinking are radically different, totally diametrically opposed. If I think that feeling is important, I must be devaluing thinking. Did I say it? If feeling is important, then thinking must not be important. In China, that never happens. In China, the word for heart, xin, is also used to mean thought, mind. And Mengzi Mencius says someplace that the eyes and the ears can lie, but the heart is an organ that thinks, and therefore the heart never lies. You know, that's one possible explanation for why Chinese people like my somatic approach. But you know, my wife is Russian, and I've lived in Russia for 2 years, and I've been invited to give guest lectures in Russia, and my experience in Russia is very different from China, even though my wife says she feels totally at home in mainland China because it's like the Soviet Union where she grew up. She doesn't much like it, but feels it's familiar. But in Russia, the attitude seems to be everything important in the world was invented by Russians, and foreigners really have nothing to teach us. In China, the attitude is pretty much the opposite. The foreigners are the great authorities. They come here with their wisdom, and we worship them. So I mean, there's that cultural difference that makes it very attractive to go to mainland China because I'm always treated so well there. Whereas I once gave a lecture in Moscow State University. I was hired to talk about the last 30 years of Western translation theory. And I was talking about Skopos theory in the 80s in Germany, and how they said that equivalence is not important. That's not the main purpose of translation. And a professor in the lecture interrupted me, said, excuse me, Professor Robinson, would you mind if I address my students for a moment? She talked for 10 minutes in Russian, perhaps not knowing that I understood, saying, don't believe him. That may be just fine for foreigners, but this is not how we work in Russia. Equivalence is the only important thing in translation. She went on and on and on, and finally said, thank you, and sat down, and I continued my lecture with my mouth hanging open. It's like, who does this? What kind of situation is this where a person interrupts my talk to tell the students not to listen to me? But that, you know, Russia has a lot of that sort of attitude. And my wife has never really wanted to live in Russia since we got out.
Subversion of power differentials. They're inviting somebody to argue with them to their backs.
Obviously, that professor didn't invite me. She just brought her students along.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so she didn't have to teach that day.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well. We have a question from Professor Dr, who cannot come in the Zoom, I believe, but she's one of our professors of literary translation at FASE. I guess she's trying to come in Zoom and she cannot yet, but she asks, How has your view about power differentials changed with every experience you've had? And which stage is translation studies in as regards the West and the rest? Has much changed? That's 2 questions. So power differentials first.
Well, yeah, power differentials are a problem for the people in power because they tend to blind you. So my privilege as a man, as a white man, as a white Western man, white Western male privilege tends to blind me to a lot of voices, a lot of subtle subterranean orientations beneath the surface of various arguments about translation coming from other places in the world. I'm a co-editor at Target, and most of our submissions come from the Middle East and Asia, some from Africa, some from South America, a lot from the Spanish-speaking world, in fact. Very few actually from people like me, Anglophone white males. And so I have to keep interrogating my own privilege, keep trying to bring the blindness imposed on me by white male Western privilege into conscious awareness, so that I can take some sort of tentative steps to remediate, to improve whatever inclination I might have to favor people more like me. The problem I have is often that, I'll get a submission that requires competence in 4 different areas, like Arabic, Japanese, sign language, and children's literature. And so I've got to find somebody who can do all that, preferably 2 people. And so if I find one person who can do Arabic and Japanese and one person who can do sign language and children's literature, each of those 2 people will say, I'm not competent in those other 2 areas. It's very, very difficult to find people. And then, if I find their names, I find one person who can do all of it, I can't find their email, because many universities in the world today do not provide email addresses for their academic staff. Or
they're probably in caves, devoting themselves only to study, like Saint Jerome.
I don't understand it. It's bizarre. Why do universities not provide email addresses? I have to have an email address. And then I'll find an email address.
We don't actually.
You don't? Oh, okay. Yeah. So this causes all kinds of problems in attempting to redress the Eurocentric bias of translation studies. And I've published on this. My book, Exorcising Translation, is about the attempt to exorcise the demon of Eurocentrism, the spirit of European privilege that blinds us to the rest of the world. And so it's a series of attempts to engage those clashes. And I forget who mentioned, it was Maria Laura. You mentioned heterolinguality, which is Sakai Naoki, right? He talks about homolingual and heterolingual. And I use his notion, Sakai's notion of the haunt of Eurocentrism, how Eurocentric thinkers are haunted by this view, and so this is an attempt to exorcise that haunt. So it's difficult for me to answer the question about power differentials, because even though I don't feel like a particularly powerful person, I'm not politically powerful, I'm not wealthy, I'm and so on, but in the field of translation studies, I do have a certain privileged position that unfortunately does often blind me to the effects of those power differentials.
Is that why you took the decision of, why you made the decision of publishing transgender translation translingual address? Was that related?
Yeah, definitely. I didn't mention that I'm a cis straight male also, which would tend to blind me to this, to the queer, to transgender and other post-binary sexual orientations and identifications and so on. That book was actually born in a session that Marco Sonzogni arranged at the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. It was a translation studies conference based on the notion of cultural sustainability, and the very first session was a transgender session with 12 transgender people speaking about their experience. And I was sitting there thinking, we are at a translation studies conference and we're talking about transgender. Why? What is going on? The session was fascinating, but I was trying to build a bridge between translation and transgender, and suddenly I realized it's trans, right? Trans is across. And so the acrossness of dialogue is the inspiration for that book. So it's transgender, translation, translingual address. And translingual is my addition to Sakai's binary between homolingual and heterolingual. The translator has to be involved in translingual address, which for the homolingual community is impossible, and for the heterolingual community is so common, so ordinary, so pedestrian, it's not worth noticing. So translingual address as bridging those difficult cultural boundaries became the theme of that book. And so I was not writing as a cis straight man about transgender people, but rather engaging in dialogue between trans and cis, between MTF and TFM, male to female, female to male, right? The various factions in the debate over transgender. So I was inserting myself into these dialogues and looking at the connections and the bridges and the turbulences in the conversations as well.
It's really a fascinating volume, really. Working on it, and I keep working on it, and takes a lot of, it takes a different paradigm in the head. So it's a bit like taking one's head off and putting it on again and screwing it on again, and thinking of translation in a completely new way.
I use Calon and Latour's notion of translation as speaking for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
The sociology of translation as speaking for somebody else,
mm-hmm.
which is an act of persuasion, but also an act of violence. And you find a lot of cis straight people speaking for the transgender community. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to speak for anybody, but how can you help it, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the sociology of translation, that we do tend to speak for other people. And the trick then is to make yourself as aware as possible of the pitfalls of that. When I came back from New Zealand and told my wife that I had this great idea for a book, transgender, translation, translingual address, she said, "Ooh, you better be really careful." And I said, I know, I don't know how. And the two reviewers that the editor at Bloomsbury Academic found for it were just astonishing, the very best reviews I've ever had. They said, We love this book. This book is fantastic. This book has to be published. It has to be read by every transgender person in the world, but it's missing a ton of stuff. This author needs to go back to work. He needs to spend at least 6 months to a year reading this and this and this and this and this and this. They sent me this long list of things, and I did it. I took 6 months and took all of their suggestions into consideration, thinking, you know, thanks for the help. I really appreciate this. It may not protect me completely, but I do feel safer with, you know, some more advice from the transgender community on how not to deal with the issues.
How not to mansplain or cisplain or whitesplain or any version of the splain. Yes.
Yeah. And I did a book launch. I went back to Wellington, New Zealand to do a book launch, but I also did a book launch at my university, at HKBU, and one of my colleagues and close friends who is transgender himself, he still identifies as male, but wants to transition to female, came to it, and he raked me over the coals in a very nice way, but, you know, very critically, of pushing me hard on some issues that are really important for him. And you know, I was thinking, oh shit, here we go. I'm in trouble now. But I managed to get through. Yeah, it was really, really good. You know, it was a fantastic moment for me, dealing with a man that I respect and admire and like personally, and have talked to as a man and as a woman. Right now, he cross-dresses, but he really identifies as a woman more strongly than he does as a man.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're certainly a scholar who takes risks. Nobody can deny that. You've taken every risk imaginable in scholarship, really.
There are probably some that I haven't taken. Maybe I'll find some more. I do like to set myself new challenges with every book manuscript.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering whether we have any more questions from people who came in Zoom. This is the time, people, because otherwise I have lots. I can just continue asking, and we'll be here all day, all night. Transoceanically.
Because I am going to need to go teach a class in 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm. All right. So
there is a deadline.
Last call for the train then. Somebody just came in. Let's give it a moment. Now this is the time for the last question. And if it's not coming, then sorry, I'll ask it. There's a phrase, they call it a slogan, but it wasn't really a phrase that you used recently as a roundup for the IGTV series that you did on Instagram. And I really loved it, and I really want a t-shirt with it. It will come, it will appear at some point. And it was something like, be open to translating the monster. Yeah. I thought that was wonderful. So could you give us a brief trailer of what you meant by that?
I am writing a monograph called Translating the Monster. And the subtitle is, let me see if I get this right. It keeps changing. Walter Kilpi, the guy I'm working on, the author of the Gulliver book that I just published. Walter Kilpi, in orbit beyond untranslatability, with un in parentheses. So it's beyond translatability and beyond untranslatability, beyond that binary between the translatable and the untranslatable. And the monster is something I borrow from Jacques Derrida. The monster is that which cannot be reduced to a tidy explanation, whatever thwarts us, whatever in style, in Derrida very often is style. His style cannot be reduced to this or that model or exemplar. It could be the problems of time. I have one section on one chapter on the future and the past, in the sense of the tensions between modernizing and archaizing, the so-called paradoxes of translation are really irresolvable, and that irresolvability is the monster. Any kind of experience, a phenomenology of being trapped between binary poles and unable to find a way out, no exit. That's the monster. And a lot of translation theory, and certainly probably most marketplace translations, avoid that. They reduce translation to a nice, tidy pattern. They simplify things until everything is clear. And there are no problems then. There are no anomalies. There are no debilitating paradoxes that make you want to quit. And so the IGTV series that I did a month or two ago began with Walter Benjamin on translatability, and then went to Emily Apter on the untranslatable with a capital U, Benjamin on the essential translatability of all literature, and Emily Apter effectively on the untranslatability of all literature, because she's a comparative literature scholar, and translation always distorts. You can't trust the translation for anything, because it's always different from the original. That would be the pole, translatability versus untranslatability. And then Jacques Derrida is the third. I guess I have an introductory section. The second episode is Benjamin. The third is Emily Apter. The fourth is Jacques Derrida. And there I introduce the notion of the monster as the irreducibility and irresolvability of all these tensions and problems that we experience in translation, in order to encourage people to engage those without trying to impose simplistic solutions on them.
So we end up becoming friends with the monster.
Not necessarily friends. You know, your engagement with the monster may be violent. It may be fearful. Mm-hmm. You may feel like you are running for your life. And if you feel friendly, that may betray you. You may get in really serious trouble. Mm-hmm. And I suppose, you know, if you think of the transgender book in that way, you know, the slippage between any two categories you like to name in transgender discourses about or as transgender, there are always those slippages, and they're always dangerous. They're always trouble. And so the safe thing to do is not to engage at all. But I think it's important to take those risks.
We don't want safe.
Confess your inability, right? To say, I can't solve this. This is beyond me. I'm just recording my engagement.
Mm-hmm. I really love that. And I think that's a beautiful place to round up, beautiful bow to this special moments that we've shared. We know you have a class, and we don't want to impinge upon your time too much. We've done enough of that.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening. People have been listening for a long time now, and that requires patience and goodwill. I thank you for that.
Thank you for this beautiful opportunity again, for your patience. I said that and I will say it again, and I will say it many times. And let's hope that we can continue having this it's not transatlantic, it's not transoceanic, antipathy conversation across the globe.
Well, and once the travel bans are lifted and people start traveling again, I am very eager to visit Argentina.
Oh, I certainly hope so. Let's try and make it happen. We're certainly going to send some ambassadors. I've seen we have people interested in going over to China, evidently. Lucina is there. I can see her. Say hi. So definitely we will have crossings, comings and goings.
Good.
Doug, thank you again.
I'm also staying up late. It's now 10 a.m. here, and I'm going to go teach in a few minutes, and you will maybe go out to dinner. I don't know how Spanish your eating habits are, but if it's at all like Spain, you're heading to dinner soon, right? I
think our eating habits have been put upside down by the pandemics, really, by lockdown. At least some of us. We don't know what clocks are anymore. We've forgotten about the passage of time in many senses. Thank you again. Really, no words to thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye then.